So I am Catherine Ross, and I sit in the Central Cathedral and Church Buildings team at Church House, Westminster. But today's topic, defining and measuring net zero carbon, goes far broader than just churches and cathedrals. So today I'm presenting the kind of collected work from a lot of different people and teams in a number of different places around the church. And that means that there might be questions that you have that they might not be in my particular field, and I might have to get back to you at the end, but I'll do my best to give you that overall picture. You probably know February's General Synod set the whole church a task to work to achieve year-on-year reductions in emissions and urgently examine what would be required to reach net zero emissions by 2030 in order that a plan of action can be drawn up to achieve that target. And that call from General Synod requires us to define what we mean by net zero carbon. Some of you will already have read the National Guidance Notes on measuring net zero. And if you have, you'll find that this webinar goes over much of the same ground. I kind of go through the topics in that National Guidance Note, explaining some things a little bit more. So feel free to kind of half listen in and half do something else. If you haven't read the National Guidance yet, then everything here will probably be new to you, and I hope that you find it very helpful. The definition of net zero is by its nature somewhat technical in nature. So today is a slightly technical webinar. However, it's also of real strategic importance, and I hope that doesn't get lost in the technical nature of it. So it's really strategically important because everything we as a church define as being in scope of our net zero target is determining what the church is taking responsibility for, to either reduce to zero by 2030 or pay to offset the residue. So it's a real strategic question. What are we saying as a church we are responsible for, and we then need to take action to bring those things down to zero or offset them. Zoom tips quickly, because I think we're all getting used to this stuff by now. If you go up to the top, there should be some view options, and side-by-side options will probably give you the best layout. Mute microphones, and to ask questions, put them into the chat, and I'll come back to the questions at the end. There is quite a lot of content in this webinar, so in the last 2 times I've run it, there's only been about 5 minutes for questions, just to let you know, but I will do all I can. What we're covering today, why net zero carbon, what do we need to measure? So defining terms and what's our scope, what's our baseline, what do we know about where we're starting from, and then the how. How are we going to measure our carbon for our churches, our schools, our housing, our travel, our land, and everything else. The consultation process that's just opened on all of this, and then next steps and questions. We also have other webinars on wider topics on action planning, forming your net zero carbon team, and how to tackle your buildings. So if you want one of those, please sign up for those other webinars. The place I really need to start is just making it completely clear up front. We don't know everything yet. We don't have all the answers, and I can't give you all of the answers today. The Synod motion was passed through in February, and since then clearly there's been the COVID crisis. So we've been working hard to try and pull together this work and put together the pieces of the picture, and different people are working on different elements, but we don't have all the answers yet. I can tell you what we do know and what we don't know, and it might be that somebody on this webinar can help me fill in one of the pieces. Some dioceses are moving faster. So London, for example, has led the way for years on the carbon footprinting of churches. Oxford is making steps forward in measuring the whole of their diocese carbon footprint. Bristol and Oxford are doing surveys of clergy housing. So I'm able to learn from dioceses and then share that around. It might be that you find at the end of this session you've got a lot of questions as well as some answers, but at least you'll know the latest position. And at the end, I'll tell you about the consultation process and how dioceses can feedback. So why net zero carbon? As I said, this session is a slightly dry and technical talk, but it's in the context of us having a climate emergency and a separate but connected ecological emergency. We're already seeing increasing frequency of extreme weather events and the terrible havoc that they wreak, and global heating of over 1 degree already, and we're on track for 3 or 4 degrees, even taking account of the Paris Climate Accord. The science is clear. Many scientists have reported, and a lot of those were summarised in that landmark report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The scientific analysis is telling us worldwide, mankind has to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero carbon by 2050. And General Synod have called for all parts of the church to move much faster than that. They've set up a prophetic challenge of planning for net zero by 2030. And this is firmly rooted in the mission of the church, the 5 marks of mission, of which the 5th to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. In this context, cutting our greenhouse gas emissions so that we're no longer contributing to global heating and climate change. And because climate change is also causing injustice, you can make a very strong case that having a more environmental church also weaves right through all 5 marks of mission. So, on to the technical stuff. What do we need to measure? Let's define some terms first. The first is defining our terms of what the word carbon mean in this context, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprint. So, carbon is just used as a shorthand. It's a shorthand for the emissions of carbon dioxide and a bundle of other greenhouse gases generated by the activities of an organisation. Every activity, turning on a light, warming up a radiator, driving a mile, buying a ream of paper, has a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. You often see that acronym, GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. The sum of all of these emissions over a time period are an organisation's greenhouse gas emissions for that period of time, and they're generally measured in tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, or TCO2e. And the equivalent is because some greenhouse gases have more of a warming effect than others, so they're converted and bundled together using agreed factors to make that carbon footprint of greenhouse gas emissions shortened to carbon. And just to give you a sense of, what's a tonne of carbon dioxide, so this is our tonne of carbon dioxide here, the space that it would take up. And a typical UK citizen's carbon footprint will be between 10 and 12 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. So what is net zero carbon? For a typical building within the Church of England, if you take the energy use of that building, so the oil, gas, electricity, and you multiply it by standard conversion factors, and you add to it the fuel from reimbursable travel, so petrol, diesel, also multiplied by standard conversion factors, that gives you the majority of the gross carbon footprint of one of our buildings. These conversion factors or carbon factors are set every year by the government, and I'll show you that in a second. From our gross carbon footprint, we can then take off 2 things: 100% renewable electricity and carbon offsets or sequestration. Carbon offsets, where you're paying to reduce carbon somewhere else in the world, like a form of trade. So you say, our carbon footprint is this much, so we will pay to offset that. That might be by restoring a forest somewhere else in the world, modernising a power plant, increasing the energy efficiency of buildings and transportation. Carbon sequestration, meantime, is where you're capturing the carbon for the long term in a solid or liquid form. And in our context, we might be talking there about nature-based solutions such as planting trees, increasing vegetation, or improving the soils of church land. So once you've taken those 2 things off, you've got the majority of the net carbon footprint. And that's what we've been challenged by General Synod to get to 0 by 2030. So net zero carbon, we're saying the greenhouse gas emissions of our organisation have been radically reduced to a low level by cutting waste and reducing energy use, and the remaining residual emissions have offset in some way so that the organisation's net greenhouse gas emissions are now 0. Another important definition is the difference between energy use and carbon footprint. So our energy use is under our control. The carbon this equates to is found by multiplying that energy by those carbon factors, and that gives you the carbon footprint. Those carbon factors aren't under our control. They're changing gradually over time. As the national grid decarbonises and there are fewer oil-fired power stations in the mix and more renewables, the grid is decarbonising. Electricity is becoming cleaner over time, and this is a really good thing. However, it means that each unit of electricity we use equates to slightly less carbon over time, even without us doing anything at all. And to a lesser extent, the same thing is happening with gas, as a proportion of green gas or biogas is starting to be available. It's important, therefore, that we keep track both of real reductions in energy consumption and the subsequent larger reductions in carbon that this equates to. The carbon factors that I mentioned earlier. So each year, the government releases, updates this document here, Greenhouse Gas Reporting Conversion Factor. This is the 2019 one. And when you go into it, you get a big Excel spreadsheet with lots and lots of different factors, which are the standard and set by scientists for the government to say what each bit of energy use equates to. And they're updated every year. So for example, 1 kilowatt of electricity, including these factors, is 0.316 kilograms of CO2e. So these are really the critical things when it comes to working out what the carbon footprint is when we know how much energy we've used, because we'll know how many kilowatts of electricity we've used, we'll know how many litres of oil we've used, we'll know how many miles we've driven in the car. You then multiply them by these standard factors and that gives you your carbon footprint. The next key thing to define is what the boundaries are of an organisation. So for most organisations, this is pretty simple. Defining net zero, what are we responsible for? Most organisations can say, well, operationally and financially, these are the things we're in charge of. However, the Church of England is never simple. We're a much looser and more complex sort of federation of many parts. Each church, school, cathedral, diocese and institution has decision-making authority over its own activities. Most are separate legal organisations with their own charitable objects. And together we're collectively responsible for the Church of England's overall carbon footprint. So each part, each of you dialing in, might therefore want to distinguish between those things under your direct control and those things you can influence but not control. So for example, in a diocese, the things the diocese are actually in control of, operationally and financially, are, so for example, the diocesan office, clergy housing, the fabric of the schools which are under your control, glebe land and staff travel. There's then a set of things which are significantly under your influence as a diocese, particularly the church and school energy use. And then there's a whole set of things which, whilst they're in your sphere of concern, they're not really under your control or particularly under your influence. So parishioners travel, clergy families, lifestyle. So for each of you joining this webinar, one of the key things you'll need to do is think for your bit of the Church of England, what's in your control, what's significantly under your influence. And these are the things which you would think of as being your carbon footprint. And then there's the things which are, you'll want to influence them. You'll still see it within your mission to try and influence them, but they're not within the scope of our 2030 target because they're not under our control or influence. And one more really important distinction is between Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. These are absolutely standard definitions which are set down by the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and they're used by all sectors, all organisations. Scope 1 are the direct greenhouse gas emissions which come because you're burning fossil fuels, either gas or oil in our boilers or petrol or diesel in our fuel tanks of our cars. So we, as an organisation, are directly burning a fossil fuel. That's our Scope 1. Scope 2 is the indirect from the electricity we buy. So there's a power station somewhere that is burning oil or coal or gas, and the electricity from that power station is what we're using. Those are your Scope 2 indirect emissions from purchased energy. So across our direct and indirect Scope 1 and Scope 2, that's where we're talking about the gas and oil being burned in our buildings for heating, our churches, offices, housing and schools, and the petrol and diesel used for reimbursable work travel, and the electricity that we're using for lighting, for example, or electric heating. Scope 3 is kind of everything else. So Scope 3 covers other indirect emissions such as the materials that go into things that we buy, or our use of water, or our waste disposal. It's everything else that we do that isn't covered by Scope 1 and Scope 2. And these things are sort of linked in a web. So if we buy a ream of paper, the carbon footprint of that ream of paper would be our Scope 3, but somewhere there's a paper factory who used electricity and heat to create that paper, and it would be their Scope 1 and Scope 2. Most organisations, when they start trying to tackle their carbon footprint, they start with Scope 1 and Scope 2, because those things are easier to measure and easier to control. And so most organisations' journey is to start with Scope 1 and Scope 2 and then move on to thinking about Scope 3 later. Right, so what is in and out of our scope here in the Church of England? Guidance has been issued defining our proposed scope of net zero, and that's what's now out for consultation, and we're looking for responses to see if we've got it right. It's gone out to diocesan secretaries, cathedral deans and administrators, diocesan environment officers, directors of education. It's going out to archdeacons and members of key committees. And the proposals in this national note aim to set out guidelines for consultation and agreement, because we're aiming to have a single nationally agreed and manageable definition that we're all working to around the country. We think a standard definition will really help all church bodies develop common ways to measure their emissions as a vital first step towards reducing them. And to repeat what I said at the beginning, it's a strategic thing as well as a slightly detailed and technical thing. But the strategic thing is that what we define as being in scope, what I'm about to show you, is what the church then has to take responsibility for and reduce to zero by 2030 or pay to offset. So the definition is now open for consultation, and when you look in that national document, you'll see that the key questions which are included in the consultation survey are marked with a blue pen, but meantime, nationally, we're using it as our kind of working assumption for planning purposes. What's in our proposed definition to be in scope by 2030? What we're saying is primarily the energy use of our buildings, so gas, oil, or other fuel, and electricity purchased, no matter the source it's purchased from, because renewables is taken off later, for the following buildings: our churches, including our church halls and ancillary buildings, our cathedrals, our schools, but only the voluntary aided and diocesan academy trust schools where we have a degree of operational and financial control, clergy housing and bishops housing if it's wholly owned by the church, our offices, Church House Westminster, diocesan offices and bishops' offices, peculiars if they come under faculty jurisdiction, other diocesan property including the common parts of tenanted properties, and the TEIs, the Theological Educational Institutions. We're proposing nationally to include in that these two factors here, well to tank and transmission to distribution factors, and these take account of the losses in the chain from where the electricity was created or the gas or oil was taken out of the ground and brought to us. This is up for consultation because it's a point which you could argue either way, but nationally we think it's right to include them. And then the other factor is the petrol or diesel used for work-related travel. So it's useful, I think, just to stop and reflect at this point for a second. That these are the items which nationally we're proposing need to be, by 2030, radically reduced and the remainder offset if we're to meet the call from General Synod that they set in February. And a key question from the consultation process is whether we've got this right. Is there anything in here that actually should be excluded? Is there anything missing that actually should be included? Moving on then, the second section is about what we see as being in scope, but in a later phase of work, so after 2030. So these are things where we're thinking nationally, yes, the church is responsible for them, but we don't think that they're what General Synod intended to be tackled in that net zero by 2030 target. They should come later. And the first of those is the emissions from our major building projects, new builds, extensions, reorderings. This is perhaps the knottiest issue in the consultation, and one you can absolutely argue either way about whether it should be in scope before or after 2030. So I'm going to come back and talk about that specifically in a little bit. We're also thinking after 2030 should become procurement. So the pews for churches, paper and printing in our offices, cars for bishops, catering for events. We think those things should be in scope, but after 2030. Water and drainage, waste disposal, the emissions of the contractors that we use when they're on site, emails and internet, diocesan investments if there are material amounts, and air conditioning gases. In standard greenhouse gas definitions, these are those bits of our scope 3 emissions which are most within our influence to a significant degree, whereas the things that we had in that green section before were primarily our scope 1 and scope 2. And a key question for the consultation is whether we've got this right. Is there anything here that actually should be brought forward? Is there anything here that actually should be out of scope altogether? And then out of scope, the things that we're proposing nationally would stay out of our scope, but critically, they would still be within our mission to try and influence them. But we're saying that we don't think they're our responsibility to measure and bring down to zero. Travel of staff, clergy and volunteers to and from their usual place of work and ministry. The travel of the public to and from churches and schools. Clergy, family and residents' greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from things that they buy, their travel, their holidays. What we think is that we should take account of a sensible, average, reasonable use, and anything beyond that is really down to the clergy's families themselves. And the personal greenhouse gas emissions from the lives of our worshippers and our church users. And then the voluntary controlled schools. So these are schools which are fully controlled by the local authority. The elements on this page in standard greenhouse gas definitions are really kind of either outside of scope 1, 2 and 3, or they're in scope 3, but we have very little operational influence over them. And again, the key question for the consultation is, have we got this right? Is there anything in here that actually our consultees think should be brought in scope because they think we are responsible for them? The definitions I've just shown you, the green, amber and red, we've had input from a really wide range of people, so I hope that they are correct or nearly there. But that's what the consultation process is for, is to find out whether dioceses and cathedrals and other consultees think we've got it right. And it's worth reflecting that there's an important reputational issue here about these definitions. Are we as a church holding ourselves to the same standard of definition and measurement that we're requiring others to meet? For example, if we're choosing which companies to invest in or divest from. I said I'd come back to that issue about building projects. So it's important to understand this difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. Operational carbon is the carbon from all of the things it takes to run our buildings, the heating and the lighting of the buildings once they're up and running. Whereas the embodied carbon is about everything that's gone into creating that building, the concrete, the steel, and the energy it took to building things, to those things to site. It's one of the ways in which the Church of England actually has a very good claim to have many of the most sustainable buildings in the land, is that the embodied carbon in our buildings was invested many centuries ago often, and often from very local materials. The proposal at the moment that I've just shown you would rule out, so it's not currently proposed to make the embodied carbon part of net zero targets. And that's a key question for the consultation because it does create some anomalies. So for example, if a church school built a new science block, then the energy used to heat and light that block after it was constructed would be included in scope, but all the energy and materials used to build that building would be out of scope. If a church decided to put solar panels on or replace its lighting, then the reduction in its energy use would be captured within scope because it's operational, but the embodied carbon in those panels and light fittings would be excluded. So a strong argument can be made that we should bring those building projects inside scope. However, if we're going to do that, we need to be able to see a practical way to measure it. And at the moment, we haven't found that way. And we need two things to be able to do it. One of which is a methodology that says for each light fitting, for each bit of stone, for each steel I-beam, how much carbon is that? But we would also need a system for capturing all around the country what building projects we have going on and knowing what's happening in them. Now, on the first of those, so having that methodology, the Green Building Council is doing some really good work on this. The RCIS and the Royal Institute of British Architects have approaches, so we can see bits of that picture, and we're looking at those. But on the other side, having a workable system for every diocese to collate the information every year about building projects, well, that would be a real challenge. We've got the faculty system, but at the moment we don't ask those questions within the faculty system. But for our schools, we don't even have a system like that. And for clergy housing, again, we don't currently gather that information. So if we do decide after the consultation, if what comes back to us from consultees is actually we think you've got that wrong and building projects should be in scope, then staff will keep working on trying to find that methodology, but it will also require dioceses to develop those systems for being aware of all the building projects happening and measuring the size and scale of them. What's our baseline? So this is, what do we know about where we're starting from with our carbon footprint? So the last baseline study that was done was 2012, a good few years ago, but it's the latest information we have. And back at that time, 430 buildings of different types took part in the National Energy Audit, and it showed that our total carbon footprint from the church estate was just over, well, between 600,000 and 1 million tonnes of CO2e. That was down 7% from the 2007 study, and the average diocesan footprint was somewhere between 14 and 24,000 tonnes. Quite a wide range because dioceses are of different sizes. It's a useful information to have lodged away at the back of your mind, though, because if you're working within your diocese or working out your carbon footprint, we'd expect your answer to come in this kind of order of magnitude, probably a little bit at the lower end, because in the last 8 years, the grid has decarbonised significantly. The 2012 baseline study also showed us where our carbon footprint is coming from. So just over half from our schools, and then about 2/5 from the churches, and the rest clergy housing, offices and cathedrals. Why so much from our schools when we've got 3 times as many churches as schools? Well, that's because these are buildings where the heating and the light is on nearly all of the week and at a temperature suitable for children to be learning in. So each school has a higher carbon footprint. We can see that when we look at the carbon footprint that they found by building type. So the highest was Church House Westminster, because it's a big office with many staff in it. And then after that are large cathedrals and our secondary schools. So our biggest buildings where the heating and the lighting is running a lot of the time. After that, the smaller cathedrals, primary schools, large churches and diocesan offices. And you can see that actually our churches, many of our small and medium churches are quite low energy users. And that was reconfirmed recently. We've been doing a whole series of energy audits and then analysing the results of those church energy audits. And this graph shows you the energy use of 80 churches and church halls. Each column is one church. The orange is gas or oil, the blue is electrical. You can see this green line is the average energy use. And what it shows us is that many of our churches, which are only being used 3 hours, 5 hours a week, are already very low energy using churches. We've then got a set of kind of medium and then a handful of the higher energy using churches. And in my other webinar on a vision of a net zero church, I then take you through what might we then do with each of those kinds of churches to move them towards net zero. The energy audit process is also showing us really clearly that the biggest use of energy is our heating. 72% church energy use is on heating. So if you are joining today from a diocese and sitting and thinking, where do we start? Where do we start is identifying those highest energy using buildings. So office, cathedral, secondary schools, and then your major churches and your primary schools. And particularly thinking about their heating and thinking, what can we do as a diocese to tackle those? Because that's where you'll have the most impact. Moving on then to how can we measure our carbon? This gets me back to that jigsaw at the beginning. We've got some of the pieces, but we don't have all of them. Churches are where we've got the most of the answer. And then after that, we've got parts of the answer. So for our churches, we have 2 related tools, the Church of England Energy Footprinting Tool and the Climate Stewards Eco Church 360-degree carbon. And I'll take you through each of those. So the Church of England Energy Footprinting Tool is a massive step forward for the Church of England. It gives us the footprint for the energy use in every church, as long as the church enters some fairly simple information. It's simple to use. It was designed by our National Research and Stats team to take 5 minutes. The idea is that each church completes it annually, which means we'll be able to track progress both at the church level, but also at the diocesan level and at a national level. And it allows for that reporting. Please, 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 wherever you're joining from, please encourage all the churches that you have any influence over to complete the EFT. When they go on, so they go on to the existing online parish return system that they're used to using. And up till now, they've seen the parish finance returns module and the stats for mission module. And now there's a third module, the energy footprinting tool, which of course is coloured green. And when they click in to enter their data, first off, it asks them what fuels they use. And so you tick on this drop-down menu of what sources of energy that church building has. And then there's an option to pick if there's another building that you want to enter information for. So for example, for church hall. And this is really important because quite often our church halls are being used more than our churches. So the energy bills are often higher for church halls. So it's really important to capture that information. If you tick yes here, it then gives you another drop-down menu of what sources of energy you use in the church hall. And then when it takes you through, it's automatically set up to only ask you questions about those buildings and those fuel sources to make it a little bit easier. The person who's filling it in then clicks through to the church energy use page and they enter the information from your utility bills. So it's really important that before they sit down to do this, they've rounded up the 2019 utility bills for gas, electricity, oil, whatever you use in your building. And then it asks them the church building size and the person hours of usage. Now, wherever we can, the Research and Stats Department has set this up to pre-complete. So if the church is already getting their electricity and gas from parish buying, those figures will be pre-completed. If they already have the meters squared entered into the church heritage record, then that will be pre-completed for them. And if they've already entered the person hours into stats for mission, then that will be pre-completed. But they can then overwrite those figures if they don't think that they're correct. But wherever possible, it's been made as easy and as integrated as possible. Then they click through to the results and it shows them for their church the gross carbon footprint, the net carbon footprint, and the weather adjusted. And the weather adjusted is really useful because over the years, as they do this year on year on year on year, the weather adjusted figure takes account of what was the average weather that year in that part of the country. So it's the most comparable figure. And it gives them two measures of energy efficiency, one which is per meter squared of the building, and then really importantly, this second one, which gives them their energy efficiency per person hour. And the reason this is so important is because if you've got a really successful church that's at the heart of its community and it's being used all week round by all sorts of different groups, then yes, the gross carbon footprint might be higher than for another church because you've got the heating and the lighting on. That they'll come out really well on this measure here of energy of emissions per person hour, because that's a success story. The second tool is 360-degree carbon, and this is also a massive step forward. What this one does is it gives a church a complete footprint. So it's their energy, like the EFT, but also food, water, travel, and procurement. Because it's more thorough, it also takes more time to gather the information. And this tool is a completely voluntary one. It's not built into the online parish returns like the EFT. This is a completely voluntary thing that some churches will choose to go on and do. It's not been designed for diocesan reporting or national reporting. It's been designed to give that individual church their information. And it's a really great next step for your keen churches, particularly for your eco churches. So what would be fabulous would be to see dioceses rolling out the EFT and then saying, if you're really keen, if you want to go further, do 360 carbon and then tell us the results. And then that will help dioceses learn what the extra factor is from food and water and travel and procurement that would then be able to be averaged across the other churches. So for our churches, we've got a lot of the answer. For our schools, there are two potential approaches, and dioceses, I suspect, are going to want to use some sort of combination of these. One is gathering information from the display energy certificates online, and the other is asking schools directly for their data. So let's go through both of those. The display energy certificates. This is you've probably seen these when you've been in public buildings. It's a requirement that any public building has one completed and up on display. And then they're also held online, which is why we can get access to them. So what you would need to do within your diocese is start by creating a spreadsheet with every one of the schools that's in scope and their postcode. Then you go onto this website here, and when you click into that website, over on the left-hand side, it says retrieve report using property address. You click in and you give the postcode of the school. This is my children's junior school. And it offers you two different documents here. One is the DEC, which shows you the energy use, and the other is the DEC RR, which has the recommendations that have been made to that school to make changes. You click then into the DEC, and it shows you their display energy certificate. And there's two areas on here that you want to have a look at. One up here is the total CO2 emissions. So that's the carbon footprint. And it breaks it down into heating and electricity, and if they had any renewables. But if you wanted to use this to get their carbon footprint, you'd have to get your ruler out and try and do some complicated measuring. Whereas what you can do instead is go over here to the bottom left-hand corner. It shows you the annual energy use for their heating and their electricity, and also their floor area. You take these three figures, you put them into your spreadsheet, and then multiply it up by the correct carbon factors for the gas and for the electricity, and it will give you, calculate for you their carbon footprint. The dioceses that have already done that say it takes between about half a day and a day to do that for all of your schools. And you might find it's worth asking within your diocese, it might be that your school's property officer has the time and the interest to do that. Hopefully, next year, we're going to have national resource to develop a whole suite of tools to make this easier for dioceses. And one of those would be that spreadsheet that you enter the figures into to do the calculations for you. It would still need somebody in the diocese to go in and get each deck, but it would then help you with the calculations. The second approach is just asking your schools for their data. So speaking to schools individually, finding as many as possible who are willing to record and share their data with you regularly. That's going to be particularly useful if you can encourage them to have smart meters. And then gather that information, enter it into the spreadsheet, multiply it by the carbon factors. This is going to be more work than looking at those decks, but it also means the information will be much more up to date. Clergy housing. Clergy housing, we've got bits of the answer. So we think there are three potential approaches to measuring the carbon footprint of the clergy housing. One of those is actual use submitted by clergy. The second is getting energy performance certificate and using an average use per building. And the third is a specialist survey. So let's look at each of those. Actual use submitted by clergy. The obvious advantage here is it would be really accurate because it would be their bills. The cons are, firstly, it's going to be hard to gather, and it might be seen as intrusive by your clergy families. The second is that it really varies based on the family size and lifestyle, and that's not under our control. So you could have two identical houses and have one with a thermostat at 22 and one with a thermostat at 18, one where they leave the lights on all the time and one where they're always switching things off, and they would have very different bills, and that's not within our control. What's within the church's control is the actual fabric of the clergy housing, the windows, the loft insulation, the boiler. It would be really useful, therefore, we think, to get a sample of keen clergy to give us some real information, but this isn't the main recommendation that we have. The main recommendation we have is to use the EPC. So energy performance certificates look like this. You'll be used to seeing them if you've ever bought and sold a house. And we'll have those for at least some of our clergy housing. And then for each house, you can multiply the band that it's in by average annual consumption of energy, of electricity and gas for a house of that rating. So to do it this way would involve getting the average use, multiplying it by the EPC grade. The advantage of this is that if you go and speak to the property teams within your diocese, they will already have EPCs for at least some of your clergy housing. Oxford Diocese told me that they've got them for about 20%, and that'll probably vary from diocese to diocese. Generally, you'll have them if you have ever let that property out. And the other advantage of this approach is that this is what's actually under the control of the church. So the EPC measures the building fabric and the systems like the boiler and the heating. And those things are under the church's control. The downside is we've only got them for a sample of building. So if a diocese wanted to take this approach, they might need to then invest a bit of money in getting EPCs where they don't have them. And also it's a slightly blunt tool. It's not as accurate as the specialist surveys we're about to come on to. And that's particularly if your EPCs are old. And the other thing is we're going to need to source that average data. The examples I showed you earlier are a few years old. So one of the things we need to do centrally is try and get some more up-to-date information on average energy use. At the moment, this is our recommended approach because we think it's what we can see could work on the ground. The alternative is to go down specialist surveys, so commissioning people to go out to your clergy housing and give them a really thorough review and look at the energy use and look at the bills and make recommendations. The advantage of this, accuracy, and it'll be really action oriented. You'll get reports for your diocesan housing showing what you should do about them. The disadvantage is the cost. So at the moment, we've got one diocese which is trying this approach, and they're currently in the process of commissioning consultants to do these surveys over the coming year. And what I'm really hoping we can do nationally is learn from that, piggyback on that, and learn from it and spread it more widely. In the end of the day, probably each diocese will want to use some combination of these approaches to really get a handle on the carbon footprint of their clergy housing. Whatever you use, multiplying the energy use from those buildings by the right carbon factor will then give you the gross carbon footprint of your clergy housing. But to know the net carbon footprint, which is what we're targeted to get to zero, you'll also need to find out from your clergy whether they're on a green energy tariff or whether they're already offsetting. Because otherwise, all you'll know is their energy use. You won't know whether they're using electricity from a green tariff, and you won't know whether they've already paid to plant some trees to offset their gas. Which means you might, as a diocese, need to survey your clergy maybe once a year to ask them those questions. Next is travel. So first off, what travel is in scope? So going back to the green, amber, red originally, the travel that's in scope is petrol or diesel used for work-related travel. So archdeacons on visitations, DAC members on visits, reimbursable clergy and ordinary travel, reimbursable staff and volunteer travel, and staff and clergy if they're making flights which are reimbursable for work or ministry. So it's that rule of thumb that says if the church takes responsibility for them financially through the expenses system, then we also take responsibility for them in terms of the carbon. And out of scope is the travel of staff, clergy and volunteers to their usual place of work or ministry, and the travel of the public to and fro church, school, and church events. How do we then measure it? So in theory, intellectually, this bit's very simple. You find out the miles that have been done, the vehicle they've been done in, you multiply one by the other, and you multiply that by the correct carbon factor for that vehicle, and that would give you the carbon footprint. The tricky bit for us in practice is gathering that information, having a system to know who's done what mileage in what vehicle. What I'd suggest to you is to start by just speaking to colleagues and finding out what information is already gathered. So you've got an expenses system, what's already gathered. In your finance system, you might be asking people for their car for insurance purposes. So finding out what you already have somewhere within your information system. Staff travel might be gathered, but not clergy travel. But then PCCs need to be gathering clergy travel in order to repay them their expenses. So that's somewhere within the church system, but it might be down at the PCC level. And you might find that you know the mileage, but not the vehicle. You might not know if it's an electric car or whether it's petrol or diesel or large or small. And the reason that's so important is this is just showing you some of the carbon factors for different types of vehicles, for diesel and for petrol. And the lowest carbon factor is this little mini here. Diesel mini, if it does 1 kilometre, that's 0.11 kilograms of CO2. Over here, our big luxury petrol car, 0.34. So 3 times as high as a carbon factor for those 2 different vehicles. That's why it matters that we find out what vehicle people are doing their mileage in. Realistically though, you might have to use averages. You might just have to assume at first that everyone's in a medium-sized petrol car because that's the best information you've got right now. Or you might need to do some kind of survey. Or if you're lucky, you'll find out that you've got it somewhere in your insurance information you've gathered for insurance purposes. Again, this is an area where we're hoping next year we'll have the resource to create a national tool that would help you with those calculations. So you could enter in the things and it would work you out the carbon footprint. But you would still need to be able to find a way to gather that data locally. Land. Now, coming back to my jigsaw at the beginning, this is the one where we've got the fewest pieces. Land is a really important area from the point of view of measuring our carbon. It's also probably the most complex area and where we really don't have all the answers yet. My colleagues in the church commissioners, who hold the majority of the land, are working on a methodology at the moment, and then will help us by sharing that with us. Why is it so complex? It's complex because we've got church commissioner land and glebe land and churchyard. And then within that, you've got the carbon emissions from things like farming machinery, farming chemicals, methane from livestock. But you've also got carbon offsetting from renewables like solar farms, and you've got carbon sequestration like tree planting and soil improvement and nature-based solutions. And you've also got to take into account the fact that this land is also important for biodiversity and for ecology. And you've also got to consider that alongside the financial return, rental from farmers, commercial forestry development. So there's so many factors to take into account here. The church commissioners are currently recruiting a firm of consultants to agree and apply a methodology to the church commissioners' forestry and agricultural land. And what we're hoping to do on our side of the church is to understand that methodology and work with dioceses about how we could apply it to diocesan land. So kind of watch this space. And if there are dioceses who've joined this webinar who really want to be involved in this, then please do let me know. It's important to have a quick aside, I think, on tree planting, because tree planting is a brilliant thing to do, but I think people are talking about it as if it's almost a magic answer to our problems, and it's not that. So it's just worth understanding. So a big mature tree, this tree here, that's got this lady standing next to it for scale, this big tree probably weighs about a ton of carbon, which equates to just under 4 tons of carbon dioxide. And that's over its whole lifetime. As it's grown from being tiny to being this 1-ton tree, it's absorbed about 4 tons of carbon dioxide in its mass. So that's a 4-ton benefit if this tree survives from planting right through to maturity. And many trees in tree planting schemes don't. A lot of tree planting schemes have a relatively low success rate of those trees going to maturity. It's also only a benefit if this tree was genuinely additional. And this is where some offsetting schemes have come into disrepute, because actually they've been mowing down trees in one place to put trees up. And it's also only a benefit in the long term if at the end of its life, this wood, this carbon, is locked away, for example, in being floorboards or the frame of a wooden house. Because if the tree either rots or burns at the end of its life, it's just releasing that carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. For a typical church, the energy audits show us that their carbon footprint of an average church is 26 tonnes. So that means 7 trees per year, every year, being planted to offset this typical church. So please don't take it that I'm saying tree planting is a bad thing. Tree planting is a brilliant thing to do and is absolutely beneficial, but it needs to be done in a way that means the trees survive, the trees are appropriate, they're genuinely additional, and at the end of their life, they're part of a managed scheme that means they're neither going to rot nor burn. The other kinds of buildings that we have, cathedrals. So this is a tool that we want to develop nationally, but it would basically use the same principles as the church energy footprint tool, just applying them to a bigger and more complex building. Offices, it's fairly simple with offices. You take your utility bills and you multiply them up by the right carbon factor. Theological education institutions, similarly for cathedrals, it's that same kind of principle. It's finding the utility bills and the reimbursable travel and multiplying them up. And then offsetting policy. So this again is work in progress. The underlying principle here is reduce everything you can and then offset the rest. it really bears repeating that offsetting is not a shortcut. It should only be used after real reductions in energy have been made. We want to do good, not just look good. And my colleague Jo is working on a Church of England offsetting policy. There are some key questions there. The first of which is kind of what's the start date? So General Synod has tasked us to be net zero by 2030. So does that mean we start offsetting in 2030? Or do we start doing it gradually before then? Or do we phase it in, for example, for parts of our emissions, such as travel perhaps? What kind of offset do we want to use? Reinvesting in our own energy efficiency or UK projects or projects abroad? Do we want to create a Church of England scheme, or do we want to use an existing scheme? And if we're doing that, how do we ensure the quality of it? And what's the potential for church land to be used here for nature-based solutions, tree planting, soil enrichment? The consultation process that has just recently opened. The questions include confirming the scope, so the green, amber and red, and the approach that I've just been describing to you about how we would measure it. Specifically on that treatment of building projects, the use of our land, whether dioceses would welcome us creating a national toolkit, and your views on an offsetting policy. The consultation process. So originally, we sent that national guidance out to dioceses for information back in March, but because of the pandemic, we held off opening the actual consultation process itself. But that has now opened. So on the 16th of June, the diocesan secretaries were sent the link through to the online consultation process. And what we have asked diocesan secretaries to do is ensure that we get a single diocesan response as best as dioceses can in these circumstances. We understand completely that some dioceses will not have the capacity to respond to this right now, but we know there are some that do, and I've got some that are champing at the bit. So we thought let's open the consultation process and just be realistic and say to dioceses, respond as best you can, but with a single diocesan response. It's also been sent to cathedrals, so cathedrals can respond individually to the TEIs, to our key committees and institutions. And the deadline for responses is the 17th of August. I know that some people, having looked at that chat earlier, some people joining this webinar have joined from individual churches. So if you joined from an individual church and you have a view about this, you would need to feed that in through your diocese. Next steps and questions. So centrally, what are we working on? Gathering those consultation responses, updating the definition and taking it down to the National Environmental Working Group and to General Synod. Continuing working on the offsetting policy and on the approach to land, keeping up to date with the progress in those dioceses that are moving quickly and sharing that. And then there's an application in for additional budget for the National Research and Stats team so that next year they can work on these tools, and we're very much hoping that that will go ahead. If that budget is confirmed, then next year they would work on developing that national toolkit, so cathedrals, offices, travel, schools. The diocese. The first next step is responding to that consultation, letting us know if we got it right by the 17th of August. And then if you have time to do one thing, please tell your churches about the EFT and encourage them to complete it. They need to get their 2019 utility bills together and then go on to the online parish return system. If you've got time to do more, what I would say at this stage is just focus on finding out what data you already have. So speak to your Board of Education about what data they have on schools, and do they have somebody who could do that process of going into the DEC reports or gathering data from schools. Talk to your diocesan surveyor about clergy housing. Have they already got EPC reports? How many do they have? How old are they? Talk to your finance manager about your expenses system. What information do you already gather about staff, transport? Talk to your office manager about the utility bills for your offices. And for other consultees that have joined today, again, respond to the consultation and then think about the main energy uses that you control or influence through your activities, your electricity, gas or oil, and the fuel for reimbursable work-related travel. And discuss with your colleagues how best you can gather information on those. And if you're joining from individual churches, where to start, get your bills together and go on and do the energy footprint tool and then discuss the results, talk about them with your PCC. And after that, register with 360 Carbon. And then first off, I would say just have a look around. Have a look around the different sections, understand the information you need to to gather in order to complete 360 Carbon, and then decide as a church how you want to approach it. And finally, please come along to our other Net Zero Carbon webinar.